What is up, you guys? Thanks for coming back for another episode. Today I am talking about a pattern that the ego does, and it's pretty obvious. It's egocentricity. This is a very natural thing that we do. So before you go getting down on yourself, just understand that we all do this. We think we're the center of the universe, and it doesn't present a problem unless it goes unchecked. So today, I talk about some of the more unhealthy ways that it shows up, and I cover four main ways that it shows up. And then I give you a few tools to add to your toolbox, certain things that you can do to help you get out of this ego story. When you're looping in egocentricity, you'll prevent yourself from growing, from learning, and most importantly, from connecting with other people and the people who are most important to you. So I hope you guys enjoy this episode. Welcome to the Get Out of Your Head podcast, where we talk all about the stories that keep you stuck, blocked from manifesting what you really want, and away from your authentic life. I am your host, Sarah, from Spirit, Mind, Body. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I am happy to have you here with me today. Thank you for joining me. Today, we're talking all about this ego story, and it's probably one of the most obvious because it's all about egocentricity. Basically, the story is all about how the ego thinks that it's all about it, that the world revolves around me. It's me, 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 me. And I'm going to talk about how this shows up in three big ways. And so that's what this episode is all about. It's all about identifying that and then how do we move out of it so that we can move to a place of connectedness. Next week, I'm going to talk about this ego story of fear and separation. And so this one is the very close cousin to that fear and separation. Actually, I would say that scarcity, fear and separation, egocentricity, well, they're all connected. It's really hard to separate ego stories because they definitely bleed into another. And that makes sense because the ego is all about, it has very specific characteristics and then it just keeps showing up in different ways. Every time I talk about an ego story, it's really just to shine a new light on how the ego does it. And maybe it just resonates with you in one way or another. So before we get too harsh with this story, right, we like to label things and say, okay, that's bad. And before we get too harsh with saying the ego should not be egocentric, I think there's a really popular belief that we should not be selfish or we shouldn't be so egocentric. And we really shun people who are any sort of entitled or self-absorbed or anything like that. And we just really push that away. And so I think that we just need to take a step back and try to understand where this comes from. Egocentricity is actually a very natural and quite a good thing. When you are raising children, this becomes very, very apparent, especially toddlers who have to establish their autonomy. They have to establish that they're an independent person from their parents or their caregivers, and that they have independent thought, and that they have a voice and they have power to do things. This is where they recognize their internal power, that I have the ability to do things, that I have the ability to call the shots. And so in egocentricity, that's it's kind of the far end of this. But with egocentricity, with this ego story, we have to go through this process in order to figure out that we're separate individuals and that we have our own independent thoughts and our own rights. And then we can kind of dial it back to what works for us, sort of the healthy middle way. So I always talk about putting yourself first and being selfish and making sure your own needs are met. And there's a very big difference between this sort of selfish and egocentricity selfish. So the type of selfish that I talk about is prioritizing yourself and prioritizing your needs and prioritizing your voice above everybody else's so that you can figure out what you need in order to give it to yourself. When you're whole and when you're well rested and when you're fulfilled, then you have way more to give to somebody else. That's the kind of selfish that really works for us. The kind of selfish that most people think of when they think of selfish, and the kind of selfish that I think that is right for society to say, well, we don't like that kind of selfish, is the type of selfish that I'm going to talk about today. And that's the kind of selfish where we're kind of saying, the world owes me something. I'm the center of the universe, and somebody else needs to give something to me. Somebody else owes me something. It sort of expects other people to bow down to itself. That's the kind of selfish that doesn't work. When you expect other people to do that for you, in turn, you can't say that, well, I expect you to do it for me, but I won't do it for you. So in turn, what we do is we say, well, I would do that for you. And so when we align on this side of selfishness, on the side that doesn't work, we sort of start to say, my needs are unimportant and it doesn't matter. I can just ignore what I need, and I don't need to listen to my own voice, and I'll just do something for you. And really what that leads to is toxic patterns where we're trying to please someone else in order for them to please us. And really, they're never going to be able to meet your own needs. You're the only one who can meet your own needs. You're the only one who can prioritize yourself. And so what I advocate for is the first kind, like I said, putting yourself first, making sure your own needs are met in order for you to show up for somebody else. Because when your own needs are met, it kind of becomes this outpouring of energy. When you're good, you can show up, you can be there, you can hold space for somebody else, and you sort of become the best version of yourself possible. But if you're constantly giving and giving and giving without taking your own needs into consideration, then that's where you end up short. You end up you end up in a place of resentment. You end up saying things that you don't mean. You end up yelling at somebody when you didn't mean to, losing your temper, all that kind of stuff. And that's the kind of selfish that I don't advocate for. So with that said, I just felt like I needed to clear that up, that whole selfish thing, because that is a really good lead into what we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to talk about how this ego story of egocentricity, I'm the center of the world, shows up in several different ways. So the first main way it shows up is that you don't need to learn anything new because you already know it all. You just sort of assume that you know it all. This ego story assumes that you're too good for self-improvement. And I think that some people I think they have a big shame story around this. They don't want to admit that they could not know something. And so this is where some people resist self-help or kind of look down on self-help or therapy or something like that, because and I think it's less now than it was in the past, but if you were to say, I enjoy self-help, or I got this self-help book, or I found myself in the self-help section, then what does it imply? You're implying that you need something outside of yourself to help yourself. And the ego is like, no, I don't need that. I already know everything. I'm good. And so this ego story sort of assumes I'm the ultimate authority and then there's nothing to gain from the perspective of another person or somebody else. It sort of writes things off even before it gives it a chance. It's like that person who doesn't want to read a book or who judges something before it even can give it consideration. It also shows up as getting very defensive, even if it's just to yourself. So when the ego is triggered by the way, when I say the ego, you can align yourself with the ego and then you would be you. So when you are triggered and you're in your ego, what you'll end up doing is you'll end up automatically trying to disprove the other side. Does that make sense? And this is super apparent in our polarized society today, where you can align yourself on one side or another. And once you do, you sort of assume that there's no middle ground. You have to be one or the other. And then when you align yourself with one side, you have to set out to prove that other side invalid. That's just an ego story. There's truth to every side. And if you don't see it, then I would say that you're probably stuck in your ego. And it's not saying that you condone it, right? But if you can't even give it a chance, that's because your ego is telling you that that thing is not right. And that it's because the ego likes to align itself with power and control. If you were to be, say, not in the know or on the side of wrong, then that's sort of like the death of the ego. That's sort of like saying, I'm not important or I'm not worthy because I was wrong. And that's sort of like, that's a very, very big conclusion to jump to. But I do think that that's sort of on the subconscious level, what we do or what we assume. And that's a big shame story for all of us. And so to avoid shame, what we do is we position ourselves on the side of right in order to avoid feeling that feeling of shame. So here's a little bit of perspective for you if you're stuck in this, I don't need to learn anything new type of story. You have to see ignorance as a good thing, because when you see ignorance or not knowing as an open book, then you open yourself up to knowing something new or to learning something new. If you see yourself, and you can actually even use the ego, like it's all about tricks with the ego. So you can actually use your ego to open yourself up to something new. And even if that's telling yourself that if you understand the other side, then you're going to make a better argument. And so you open yourself up that way. And really what you have to do is you just have to become open-minded. Once you're open-minded, you're receptive to information or to new information, and then automatically you're just going to adjust your viewpoint as you go or as you gain new information. But if you're not open-minded and if you're super close-minded, and maybe that's what I should have said at the beginning, like that's the hallmark of this how this shows up, is not being open-minded, being closed-minded. But when you're closed-minded, you assume that you know everything already. You're not open to growth. And what happens though when you're closed-minded is that you just block yourself. If you're holding on to this story of I'm too good for self-improvement, the only person that holds on to this story is you. The only person that is not benefiting from learning more is you. The only person who loses out when you hold on to this story is yourself, because you're preventing yourself from growing. You're preventing yourself from becoming a better, well-rounded person in whatever capacity. So think about the kind of person you want to be. Do you want to be a better parent? Do you want to be valuable to the company, a good business owner, an amazing lover, a good friend, intellectual, successful? All of those things require growth. All of those things require you to be open-minded and be receptive to new information, receptive to new perspectives. And if you're closed-minded, it's not going to work for you. And by the way, if you're probably listening to my podcast, chances are you're not a super closed-minded person in general. I'm just saying though that it does still show up for us in certain areas in our lives. And the question is, where is that showing up? And then how do I question my own self, or how do I align myself to be a little bit more open-minded so that I can continue to grow? Okay. So the second thing is, and this is maybe part 1B. This is a tangent from the first story of I am too good for self-improvement. The way that this ego story, egocentricity, shows up in this respect is that it sort of assumes that it's too good for fill in the blank. I'm too good for this job. I'm too good for this family. I'm too good for this relationship. First of all, let's just imagine we all have somebody in our lives like this, or we've seen movies with a character like this, right? Imagine somebody that you know who is like this. It sucks to be around them. They're bitter, they're self-absorbed, they're super separate, and it thinks that the world is owed to them and it's never going to be satisfied. Now, hold that image of that person and apply it to yourself. And here's my question for you. Where are you, or where have you come at life with this mindset? Where do you find yourself using the words or this sentiment, I'm too good for this thing? It could be like fill in the blank. I'm too good for this diet. I'm too good for what they're making me do at work. I'm too good for this training. I'm too good to read this book. And that is where this is going to show up for you. And this is where you can really benefit from putting your ego in check, because there's always something to learn from every situation. So you'll probably say this if you feel like you've been there or done that already. You've already ascended that ladder. It could be educational. I've already learned this. It could be through your job. I already had a job like this and then I had to move because of family situations, and now I have to take a lesser job. It could be financial. I've already earned more and now I have to earn just this much, and this is not me. Or a place that you live, say you got relocated for a job and you just see it as lower or on a lower rung. And let's just pause and say that we do this because we hold this belief in ourselves that we're worthy and we're worth so much more than that situation, which is a good thing. Let's not write this off completely. But what happens is we sort of confuse the situation externally with our internal worth. We've defined our worth by our jobs or our relationships or our situations or the place that we're living or all those things that I just said, rather than something that's an integral and inseparable part of ourselves. Does that make sense? So when you say, I'm too good for this situation, what you're saying is that my worth doesn't align with this situation. And you know you have a higher worth, but you're judging the situation as being less worthy than you are. And here's the deal. Life put you where you are for a reason. There is something to be gained or learned or appreciated about everything. There's like inner gold in every single moment, but you have to find it. All of these deplorable situations have little bits of gold that have yet to be discovered, but we just need to find them. If you refuse to even look, my experience is that it's going to come back to you over and over and over again. The universe is trying to show you something that you're refusing to see. And, maybe even that you need to take your power back, or that you need to put your self-worth in yourself, not into the external situation. Maybe it's just to learn a lesson. Maybe, who knows? That's going to be specific to you, but the universe is trying to show you something. And if you're blocking yourself from seeing it, then it's just going to keep finding you. Spirit sees everything as equal. It doesn't see someone who makes more money as less worthy or insignificant or less significant than someone who makes less money. It doesn't see people, especially people, as better or worse than someone else. Everyone is on their own path. Everyone is on their own journey. Sometimes our paths collide and we get to walk together for a little while with another. But when it comes time to say goodbye, if you're doing it with anything less than mutual respect for somebody else and for yourself, then you're in ego. That person will find you again in different clothes, in different skin, and in different body, and you'll go through the same thing over and over and over again. The whole point, I think, is just to realize that when we align with spirit, we recognize that everybody and everything is neither better nor worse than something else. And spirit sees worth in everything, in every situation, to include you. And when you say, if you come to acceptance with this, if you come to acceptance with your situation, it's not saying that you're unworthy because of the situation. It's just you have to see the situation as not lower than you. Does that make sense? Okay. The second way that this ego story shows up is by putting your self-worth into what someone else thinks of you. So there's sort of two sides to this coin. The first side, the dark side, is getting really self-conscious. This is the part of us that thinks too much or puts too much weight into what other people think of us. And then on the other side of this coin, you also put too much weight into what somebody else thinks of you, but it's on the side of external validation. So it's like praise versus getting self-conscious. And we just put way too much of our power into somebody else's hands in this case. There's a few tangible examples that I have for you. So first off, beauty standards. Man, oh man, we have a problem with beauty standards I live in the US. So wherever you are, even our society in general just has a big problem with beauty standards. We need to look a certain way, be a certain weight. We need to look put together, even if you have an off day. You're not allowed to be seen as you are. You're not allowed to be seen without makeup on. And it's very different to want to be put together and doing it for yourself versus doing it for somebody else. And if you feel like you can't leave the house without makeup, even if you're running a fever and you have to go to the grocery store or the drugstore to get something, that's the kind of self-worth that I'm talking about. That's the kind of self-worth that you're still putting into somebody else's hands. You need to ask yourself, what about me is unacceptable if I were to show my true self physically? Another example is feeling like you need to say the right thing or getting really self-conscious when you feel like you might have offended somebody. We all know that feeling of, did I say the right thing? This especially happens if you're, say, at a work party or something like that, and you have a boss or somebody you're trying to impress, and did you say the wrong thing? Did you offend them? And then just ruminating on it. That's very egocentric. Being a people pleaser. Your inner people pleaser is actually a product of your ego. And you guys know, I'm going to give it to you straight, but your inner people pleaser is basically this part of you that says that if I make somebody else happy, maybe they'll like me and maybe they'll accept me. And so you go about showing only parts of yourself and putting on a mask so that everyone else will like you. You try not to rock the boat. You try to make everybody happy. And in the process, you abandon yourself. Just think about this. You're never going to please everyone. When you work on your own self-worth and you make that intrinsic, meaning like that's nobody can take away from you your own sense of self-worth. It doesn't matter what anyone else thinks of you. You can finally take off the mask and be your own person. If I continue to put my self-worth in somebody else's hands, well, that can be taken away from me at any moment. And when I work on myself, that's something that no one else can take away from me. That's real power. Another example or something to consider is shame. Shame is sort of the underlying feeling that goes along with feeling like you didn't say the right thing, or that you offended somebody, or that you can't be seen without makeup, or did I do enough for that other person because my inner people pleaser says that other person needs something. If you don't do those things, like, that's shame at the bottom of it. Like shame or something very closely related, very, very low vibe. And if you missed it, I talked all about shame in my episode of denial as an ego story, and it probably even warrants its own standalone episode because it's so important. But shame is this feeling that you're the only one and you're defective and everyone else doesn't accept you for the way you are. It's a pretty sinking feeling. It's probably one of the worst feelings. And so we do a lot in order to avoid this feeling of shame. But here's the thing that you need to know about shame. What we find is that the shame story is actually an illusion. And I want to be very clear about this. Shame, the feeling of shame is real. You don't write off your feeling of shame. That it is real. It does exist, and we do a lot to avoid it. But the story is the illusion. Say your shame story is that nobody will ever love me because of my weight. That story is an illusion because there are many, many people who will love you regardless of what weight you are. That's where we find the untruth. Whatever your shame story is, and if you haven't listened to it, I'll link the denial episode below so you can kind of go to that part where I talk about that. But whatever your shame trigger is, what you're telling yourself about it is not real. Okay, so on the other side to this coin, remember I said that this part kind of has two sides. So the first side is getting self-conscious. The other side is needing so much external validation. We need praise for a job well done. We love getting good grades, annual performance reports, somebody telling us how great we are. We love that. And it's almost like we're saying, like, our inner child is like, how did I measure up? Did I do well? Do you like me? That's sort of the feeling, the tone that this takes on. And to be honest, I don't think that there's anything wrong with this. I think that it's a very natural thing. I'm wired to want praise, and probably so are you. But what I've found is that the closer and closer I walk to my path, the less external praise I actually need. And so that's a really good indication as to how closely you're walking your path. Does that make sense? Or what areas in your life you're walking your path? If you need a lot of external praise, it could be, and I'm just saying could, you decide for yourself, but it could be an indication that maybe you're not in alignment with that thing. Okay, secondly, you might need somebody to notice you. It might be this story wants everybody to, like, notice your haircut and notice what you've been working on. And we just want to be seen and we want to be noticed, but it's not in, like, a good connected type of way. It's in a toxic type of way. It's needy. And when somebody doesn't notice you, when somebody does notice you, it feels really good. But then on the other side, the better it feels when someone notices you, the worse it will feel when they don't notice you. Does that make sense? So here's some food for thought. No one thinks about you as much as you think about you. And I think that can be, when that realization comes from ego, that's really sad. Because we do want to be noticed, we want to get connected, we want other people to value us. But here's the thing, when it comes from spirit, that realization is really liberating, because that means that it doesn't matter necessarily what you do. When you really get that, no one else is thinking about you as much as you think about yourself. When you really get that, shame sort of just dissolves, because shame feels like you're sitting in the middle of a room, like a big room, with everybody you've ever known pointing a finger and laughing at you. That's what shame feels like. But then when you realize that nobody's pointing a finger and laughing at you, it sort of just dissolves. Like, when you take on the new perspective that somebody's probably not even thinking about what you said at that party. That person is in a totally different world, and the only person that thinks about it is you. That just liberates you to not have to feel that way. So I'll just tell you a really quick story. When I got pregnant, I was at a family gathering, and I wasn't telling anybody that I was pregnant for the first time. For the second time, I didn't really care. And I wasn't drinking at a family gathering. And I thought to myself, oh my gosh, everybody's going to know. This is going to be it. I'm going to have this big fabricated story about why I'm not drinking. And so I came up with this whole thing. And the truth is that not a single person said a word. And when I did say, hey, I'm pregnant, you guys, I said, I thought that everybody would have noticed at, I think it was like Christmas or Thanksgiving. I thought everybody was going to notice at Thanksgiving that I wasn't drinking. And everybody was like, no, I didn't even think twice about it. And so I give you that. Just try it sometime. Try doing something different in a social situation that you're pretty sure everybody's going to notice, and you will notice how much people actually don't. Okay, the third way this shows up is that this ego story assumes that if somebody hurts you, it's intentional and malicious, and we tend to take things really personally. So sometimes the ego blocks itself from finding out the truth because it feels powerful to get angry about what somebody has done to you. There's a book called Power versus Force, and I'm reading it right now, and I'm not going to really tell you what it's about, but basically he ranks all of these emotions on a hierarchy, and shame is the worst, the lowest emotion that we can feel, and anger is actually way above shame. And so when somebody hurts us, instead of being like, oh, that we feel shame for that, or we felt like we deserved it, because that's where the ego goes if it's egocentric, if it's thinking, oh, it's all about me. That's where it goes. And instead of feeling shame about it, what we can do is we can feel angry and defensive, and that actually fuels us and it gives us a little bit of power back. And so what we do is we would rather stay in that angry state instead of asking questions and trying to find out the truth about what happened or about what that person was doing, because there's a possibility that if we found out the truth, that they could be doing it because we were defective. Does that make sense? But on that note, that's just what goes on in your head. On that note, though, we have to start to realize, and the more you do your own personal work, the more you will realize the truth in this. But we have to start to realize that people hurt people because they're hurting themselves. Hurt people hurt people. When somebody is mean to you or treats you disrespectfully, it's probably because they themselves are having a bad day. And when you figure that out, you stop making that about you, and you can detach from that shame, anger story altogether and then rise even higher in this hierarchy of emotion that he talks about in this book to a place of, say, like neutrality or acceptance. And before you go saying, well, neutral isn't really a high vibe type of emotion, yes, it is, because you stop aligning yourself, you stop getting defensive, you see the equality in basically everything. That's what we mean by neutrality. Another example of how this piece of this ego story shows up is that it doesn't give people the benefit of the doubt. It assumes that if somebody forgets about your birthday or doesn't call or text you back, it assumes the worst. It assumes that somebody else is being, trying to get back at you, or is being manipulative, or is being something else. Like, it sort of just jumps to this conclusion. Also, road rage. If you're getting road rage, like, that's a very, very key place that this shows up. It assumes that somebody else is doing something else to you, and in reality, that other person is just driving and probably didn't pay attention. And whether that's right or not, your ego will take it as a personal affront to itself. This ego story says, you didn't think of me, you didn't do this for me. And it's sort of like the victim, and I'll link the inner victim below as well. But essentially, it just thinks that it's the center of the universe. And this story actually shows up a lot in parenting. So your ego, and I know this because I've been there a lot lately, but your ego will tell you that your kids' independence are actually them being bad, or your kids' curiosity is them getting into trouble or directly disobeying you, or that they're mad at you and they're trying to take it out on you, when in reality, your kids are just trying to find their own voice, trying to establish independence, that they're a separate person from you, and they're being curious. But your ego will tell you, you're not supposed to be in that, and that's wrong, and then you were directly disobeying me. Does that make sense? And so something that helps with this one is that we just need to recognize that everyone is usually in their own ego. They're generally not thinking of you, they're thinking about themselves, just like yourself. You think that someone needs to pay more attention to you, let that be your indication that you actually need to turn it around and pay attention to yourself. That's the good kind of selfishness that I talked about in the beginning of the episode. When you think that somebody else needs to do something for you, stop and ask yourself, what do I need and how can I give that to myself? So the antidote to all of these, that's kind of like overarching, but the antidote to all of the way that all these show up is that we need to have the ability to put ourselves in someone else's shoes. Seek first to understand. Assume that you don't know it all. Learn someone else's story. Learn someone else's perspective, and then give them the benefit of the doubt. And then here's another thing you can do. When you don't know, assume the best. Force yourself, or at least force yourself, to come up with another alternative or 5 stories that are actually positive. When somebody doesn't text you back and you're angry about it, or you're thinking the worst, come up with another reason or several other reasons why they weren't texting you back. Think about what happens when you don't text somebody back. Think about, could it be that they kept their phone in their car, or they're just the type of person that looks at their phone and then thinks that they responded and just didn't. There's a lot of different ways to go about this. When you take something personally, just look at it as, did they mean it like that? Or could it be possible that they meant it a different way? And this is sort of like, it comes back to being open-minded. But when you're open-minded and these things are a possibility, then see which one feels best. Because here's the thing, you don't know, unless you directly talk to them and they openly admit, yeah, I did that to hurt you, then any of your possibilities, they have equal weight. And so why wouldn't you align with the one that feels best? And the more that you do this to other people, the more you give somebody else the benefit of the doubt, really it's showing yourself self-love. You stop separating yourself from other people. And when I started doing this in my life, I just realized that like some of the drama that I sort of found myself in fell away. When I started giving people the benefit of the doubt and I started assuming, oh, they didn't do that intentionally. They just probably just forgot, or I assumed the best in people, then it's like all of the situations that could be charged or confrontational just stopped happening. And it is astounding how much more time you have for yourself and the things that you actually want to do when you're not putting all of your time and energy into fighting dramatic situations. Does that make sense? So just a last word. Sometimes there's sort of resistance to getting in the mind of another, especially when it's emotionally charged. And I think this resistance comes from feeling like if we try to understand somebody, we'll inadvertently be condoning their behavior. And that's not the case. By understanding, you make more informed decisions, but it doesn't mean that you supported your approving of what somebody else did. You can still hold several viewpoints. You can still understand why somebody did what they did without condoning it. And on that note, then, when you come to a place of forgiveness, understand that forgiveness isn't for the other person, it's for you. When we don't forgive, we harbor resentment, and it's all in all, you have to live with you, and you have to live with that low vibe feeling of resentment. And understand that resentment does feel a lot better than shame, but could you ascend to a higher place of neutrality or acceptance if you let it go altogether? Does that make sense? Resentment will keep you from cycling and stuck in the past, and that's why forgiveness is so important. If somebody hurt you, you have to come to a place of forgiveness so that you can let them go. When you forgive, you detach them from your energetic tie. Like you cut that energetic tie between the two of you, and you sort of just let them go. When you don't forgive, you hold that energetic tie together. Does that make sense? So, okay, on that, thank you guys for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I will see you next time. If you enjoyed this episode, I would invite you to subscribe, share it with someone you know, and leave an honest rating or review. You can also connect with me through Instagram at spiritmind.body, through YouTube, or my website. Links to all of these can be found in the show notes below. This work is not easy and requires tremendous self-reflection, grit, and a willingness to be misunderstood, and for that, I honor every single one of you for showing up for your authentic self. Until next time. Hey you guys, thank you so much for sticking around to the very, very end with me. I just have one last announcement for you. If you enjoy these episodes and you would like me to produce them every week instead of every other week, which is something that I would love to do for you, there is a donate link down below. What this helps me do is outsource some of these things that I just don't have that much time for, such as editing and producing this podcast. If you don't know me, I am a mother to 2 very little kids, and I have a full-time job already. And your donations really help offset some of the costs that it takes to produce on a weekly basis. Also, if you do not know me, if you have not connected with me, I'm primarily on Instagram at spiritmind.body. I would love to hear from you. My last episode of the season, which will be in April, is going to be a Q&A. So if you have any questions, comments, any way that you'd like to connect with me, please do head over to Instagram or on YouTube. Drop me a comment or a message. I would love to hear from you. Thank you guys. I love you guys so much. I will see you next week.